begin. The Declaration of Independence famously states that governments instituted among men derive their just power from the consent of the governed. It is because I agree with our founding fathers, and because I support government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that I stand resolved. A government's legitimacy is more determined by its respect for popular sovereignty than individual rights. In order to provide clarity for the round, I'll supply definitions. Government, the system or form by which a community or other political unit is governed. Legitimate, the right to hold and use power. Respect, to show consideration for, avoid intruding upon or interfering with. Popular sovereignty, ultimate authority of the people. A modern updated definition of popular sovereignty also rests on the people's ability to adopt its own basic law, as in a constitution, and propose and adopt amendments to the basic law. Individual rights, a particular person's moral or legal entitlement to have or do something. A particular person's moral or legal entitlement to have or do something. To clarify even further, the definition of entitlement is a right to benefits that is granted, especially by law or contract. Through these two definitions, we can see that one's individual rights are determined by the law under a specific government. They're not absolute, but vary from society to society. For example, Americans will soon possess the right to health care, the individual right to health care, though they have never had that right before. If you reread the resolution with the definitions I've presented, it will go something like this. A government's reasonableness is determined more by its consideration for the authority of the people than its consideration for a particular person's entitlement. Now let's take a look at why this is true. Today I'm going to value the authority of the people. Since government has no inherent right to rule, the people must empower and consent to government. Thus, government must respect the people's authority in order to achieve legitimacy. My first contention is that popular sovereignty determines individual rights. Popular sovereignty determines individual rights. We all define rights differently. Throughout the centuries, philosophers, rulers, and ordinary people have disagreed as to what rights everybody ought to have. It would be wrong for a single person to say X, Y, and Z are universal rights, and a legitimate government is only one that puts these rights into place. Because different cultures have different views on rights and how to apply them, individual rights vary by the laws of different nations. Truly legitimate governments will allow their people to determine their rights. Popular sovereignty, which allows every man an equal vote, is a fair and logical method of discovering rights. This leads me to my second contention. Government derives its power from the people. Government derives its power from the people. Referring to government, James Madison once said, "The people are the only legitimate fountain of power." Since the people are the ones who create, empower, and sanction government, they alone are the source of government's authority. They sustain government. If there were no people, there would be no government. The people bestow legitimacy, or by definition, the right to rule, upon their government. Thus, respect for popular sovereignty is essential because government legitimacy ultimately flows from the people. In an article entitled Authority, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy sums up the importance of respect for the people's will. It says, "The state, being a group of people, owes the subjects some kind of duty of respect for the judgments of those members. Furthermore, the state is in part an institution that is grounded in a need for decisions against a background of disagreement about what ought to be done. For the state to make decisions against this background that completely ignores the views of the many dissenters seems a particularly egregious violation of the duty to accord some respect to the opinions of reasonable adult human beings." In other words, the ruling political authority must respect the majority's decisions. Only when the people willingly concede power can government be legitimate. 3. Popular sovereignty is a stronger determiner of legitimacy. Popular sovereignty is a stronger determiner of legitimacy. We have seen that rights are a secondary purpose of government for two reasons. 1. Rights must be defined before they can be respected, and popular sovereignty is clearly the best way to determine those rights. And 2. The people, through popular sovereignty, give government the right to rule, in other words, legitimacy. Ultimately, government has no inherent authority apart from the people, and that is why I stand resolved. A government's legitimacy is determined more by its respect for popular sovereignty than individual rights. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
Judge ready? Everybody? All right, let's begin. How are you today?
I'm good, how are you?
Okay, I'm great. So imagine that nothing exists outside this room, that there is no food, and that I am the king. Can I eat the timer?
I'm sorry.
Imagine that.
You could, I guess, if you were the king.
Okay, would that be legitimate of me to do so?
No, because you don't have the people's consent.
All right, what if we all take a vote to eat the timer?
Well, then I guess you would eat the timer.
All right,
Has happened before.
and that would be legitimate.
Well, yes.
Okay, so basically, the majority can vote away the rights of the minority.
Yes, it is, it can lead to injustice, but it's still legitimate because it will be the consent of the people. It is a rather silly situation, or silly example.
Okay, so let's look to the example of slavery. Can the majority, because they're greater in number, take away the rights of the minority?
Well, they weren't taking away the rights, they didn't define individual rights, because individual rights apply to every person, so they weren't defining individual rights for every
So
person.
individual rights have to...
If popular sovereignty is defining individual rights.
Okay, so let's say the populace vote determines that all men have the rights to life, liberty, and property. And then the populace decides that a certain minority must lose those rights. Can that be legitimate?
Yes, it is sad and unjust sometimes, but ultimately, the authority flows from the people.
Okay, just the majority of people.
Well, everybody gets an equal vote, but ultimately, the majority is the outcome.
And the majority can tyrannize the minority.
I wouldn't say tyrannize, because tyrannize is rule of the few.
Okay, the majority can kill the minority.
Ultimately, yes, but
But
that's...
don't individual rights apply to all men?
I'm sorry?
Don't individual rights apply to all men within the society?
Well, they should, so if popular sovereignty is determining individual rights, then they would be for every person.
Okay, but so once the popular sovereignty has determined that those rights are there, they cannot then go on and infringe on those rights.
Well, right, if popular sovereignty has determined those limits for themselves, then yes.
Alright, so popular sovereignty can be limited,
Yes, popular sovereignty can limit itself.
and it can be limited by rights.
Right, if popular sovereignty decides to limit itself by rights.
Alright, now, would you say that are you familiar with Socrates, the death of Socrates?
Yes.
Okay, would you say that that was legitimate?
Well, it wasn't exactly a government situation. It was just 500 men in a court trial.
Isn't the court part of the government?
Well, it wasn't exactly a governmental decision.
It was mob rule.
Yes, it was mob rule. And popular sovereignty is not quite the same thing as mob rule.
But what is mob rule?
Mob rule is just where the majority decides to take over. But popular sovereignty is a little more complicated than that.
But popular sovereignty is the rule by the majority, isn't it?
Well, the outcomes, yes, are ruled by the majority.
Alright, thank you. No further questions.
Time 30 second interval.
Yes, please.